I don't want to talk about the country, but we had one country, somewhat high government official, that reached out and was like, well, just FYI, we will not allow Worldcoin to ever launch in this country because it will make democratic elections much easier, and we don't want that here. Which was technically a democratic country. And I was like, that is a crazy thing to say. So yeah, I think it will have, at scale, it will have all kinds of interesting consequences. I think, like, personally, seeing an election being run on that infrastructure, I think it will be super cool at scale. And because I think it's part of the whole reason we are here. It's like, I think it can be a kind of a big force for freedom and individual empowerment. And that's, I think, what the whole point of crypto is in some sense, is the freedom stack.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Mind with CoinFund. For those of you tuning in for the first time today, my name is Jake Brukhman, and I'm CoinFund's CEO and founder. We're going to keep the intro short today. It's just me hosting today's episode, but this is a conversation I'm really looking forward to having. If you're like me and you're passionate about the emerging ecosystem of the intersection of Web3 and AI, then you've definitely heard about this next company, or you've seen or heard about their orbs, which scan people's eyes. It's one that CoinFund invested in back in 2020 because we're so passionate about digital identity, proof of personhood, blockchains that disambiguate humans and AIs, and many of the other primitives that are offered in this project, as we'll discuss in detail. But this expert team has created a unique solution to this problem using some of the most cutting edge technologies, biometric data, and honestly is one of the most Web3 values compliant projects out there. Like, World actually generates more than 80% of the worldwide demand for zero knowledge proof verifications today that are on chain. They also just had an incredible event in San Francisco, making some very exciting product announcements, including a rebrand from Worldcoin to World, which I keep getting wrong because I'm still not used to saying it, being an investor for so long. But from Tools for Humanity, the company behind World, also formerly known as Worldcoin, please welcome Alex Blania to the show. Hi, Alex. How's it going?
Hey, Jake. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. So we've now known each other for a number of years. You guys have been on an incredible journey. I think you guys are one of the most amazing product companies in our portfolio. You've done hardware, you've done software, you've done blockchain, you've done cryptography, and it's all in the service of this idea of biometric proof of personhood. So just very quickly, I know you probably have to do this a lot. For anyone who doesn't know what Worldcoin is, can you tell us a little bit? What is World and Worldcoin about?
Yeah. So World is about creating the largest identity and financial network on the planet. A very small feat goal. But with that ultimate mission, we believed a couple of years ago, because Sam is one of the founders, Sam Altman from OpenAI, that the internet will enter this like rapid and drastic change. And that is because we passed the Turing test sometime during the last year, probably, meaning AI systems got so strong and are on this like exponential rise that they can now talk and interact like humans can on the internet. So we see that with chat interfaces, you can talk to an AI and it's so intelligent that it's very much could be a person and you would not know that. But similarly, we will get real-time video within the next year or so. We will get strong agentic systems. So all of those things, I think, are pointing in the direction where most of the online traffic, most of the online interactions will be driven by AI systems. And we believe that many of the things we use require some form of proof of human system. So simply stating that you can tell I'm interacting with an actual person or with an AI system that represents a genuine person. So one of those two. And well, with that belief, a couple of years ago, we started building a decentralized and kind of fully open source way to build such a system that can scale truly globally and can eventually reach billions of people. and that is World ID. Then apart from that, every individual that verifies receives ownership in the actual network. So through Worldcoin, that's the kind of the network token. A big belief in the early days that everything is about scale, everything is about network effects, and we can get to that scale by launching a digital token by giving ownership in it to eventually every human being. So that is Worldcoin. Then of course we have an underlying chain, which is World Chain. So it's an Ethereum L2 built on OP stack, which I'm sure we will talk about. And we have a non-custodial wallet called World App, which is essentially the first client to the network that people can use and do use. I think it's the second largest non-custodial wallet in the world right now with 15 million users. So it's already a pretty big app. So yeah, these are the quick highlights.
Awesome. So I just want to highlight for people a couple of things that you said. First of all, this is a project which was originally conceived by Sam Altman, who today is the CEO of OpenAI. And I want to draw attention to the fact that it was conceived in I think it was around 2020 that it was conceived. And so at the core of it, as you say, Alex, is this idea that humans and AIs are going to get so good that it's going to be hard to distinguish who's an AI and who's human. And I just want to point out that in 2020, there wasn't broad socialization of progress in AI. It was very small. We didn't start to see movement until 2022, and GPT really wasn't didn't become popular until 2023, right? I think in March of 2023 or something like that. And so you're talking about an idea that predates broader understanding of it by at least 3 years, right?
Yeah.
That is a long time in tech. So I want to point out that now we live in a world where precisely it's extremely obvious to everyone that this is a really needed technology given where we are with AI assistance and so on. Okay, so that's one thing to say. And then you mentioned a lot of, you guys have had a journey of 4 years or so where you've now landed on a number of these primitives. You have kind of the biometric proof of personhood at the core and the orb that facilitates that and all the technologies that go into the orb. You have identity, as you mentioned. Now, what you launched just last month is your own blockchain, World Chain. And then there's also the Worldcoin idea as well. And so, but let's focus on World Chain for a second.
Yeah.
Because Alex, everybody has launched a blockchain. Why does the world need another World Chain, would you say?
Well, the simple reason why we did it is that we hit the scaling limitations of what L2s could be doing. So previously we were live on OP mainnet. So I think the first important comment is we decided to go with an Ethereum secured system. And so that's why we, of course, ended up on an L2. And within that, we decided to go with Optimism, so the OP stack. And so initially we launched on OP mainnet. But on many days, we were 80 or 90% of the chain. And so things got very expensive. And given we have a pretty specialized situation, so for example, most of our users are actually verified humans, we can do things that other chains cannot do. We can, for example, we can give block space preferred to humans, and that makes things much, much cheaper. And so we want to go to that primitive where everyone that is verified can essentially transact freely on the system. And all kinds of bot transactions and whatever else can, of course, also transact on the system, but they will actually need to pay for that and subsidize all the real valid human transactions. And that's why we hit scaling limitations. We have a lot of things that are specific to us. We thought, well, it's probably best if we launch our own L2 and we can make specific changes that are specific to our use case.
Yeah. So this idea that sort of non-human or bot transactions can subsidize human transactions, I just want to point out that is absolutely completely and utterly differentiated from anything else that's out there in blockchain today. There's no other example that I can think of where blockchain could do that. Maybe it's just to drill into that a little bit. So does that mean so if I scan my biometrics with an orb and I get an ID, every transaction on this chain is free, or are there some transactions?
Yeah, so far that is the case. Of course, we will need to make the whole protocol sustainable in the long-term future. So unclear how that will look in 10 years. And it really depends on how the usage of the system is and how everything is playing out. But at least in the foreseeable future, in the coming years, that will be the case.
There could be some world, Alex, where the chain gets really popular and a lot of people launch products and services on the chain,
Yep.
and their apps are basically like paying a lot of the transaction fees, and that's subsidizing kind of human usage, and maybe
Yep.
it subsidizes all of the human usage. And by the way, I just want to point out like why that is like so interesting. The history of blockchain is that we wanted to kind of present blockchains as consumer technology, right? Like when Ethereum came out in 2016, everyone had this idea. Oh, sorry, it came out in 2015, but in 2016, it started to kind of go to market with dApps. And everyone had this idea that like normal people could get wallets, put some Ether in it, and just start using apps. The reality of that thesis turned out to be that this friction of getting a wallet, loading it with crypto that you have to go to Coinbase to buy and like set up a Coinbase account and load it with money and connect your bank account. And then that whole process of getting on chain was so burdensome that it was actually like kind of a barrier to entry for customers. And there was one blockchain in that era, which was called Steam. It was like a decentralized blogging platform, essentially, that subsidized fees for people who would sign on, and they basically didn't have transaction fees. And that was the first blockchain to convert like 1 million or so regular mainstream users. So what that
Mm.
experiment showed was if you remove that barrier to entry, then you can actually get like normal people onto your chain. It was sort of amazing to watch during that time period. Where
That's
we are
awesome.
today is we have a lot of technology that we've developed in blockchain for onboarding people, for getting them into crypto, for getting them their first wallet, for saving that stuff. But it's still like not quite at the level where a normal person can just easily go into crypto world. And here you guys come with World Chain, and you have an incredibly usable app. You said it had 15 million users already. I think you have something like 7.2 million World ID
Yep.
users as
Yep.
well. And now you're going to have a chain that doesn't have this barrier to entry.
Yep.
And maybe that's a good segue into sort of this idea of mini apps on the chain. Do you want to say a few words on that?
Yeah. So just to zoom out for 1 second before we go to mini apps, I think because I just want to make sure it doesn't sound confusing because there's like so many parts to it. Like the mission is, again, the mission is very simple. It's about creating the largest financial identity network on the planet. So essentially we just build all the things that we think are in service for that. We believe that something like that will be important because not only will AI change internet, AI will also lead to a lot of social change. And so we think that such an infrastructure will be critical for a lot of different reasons we can go deeper into. But so to mini apps, one of the topics we found ourselves discussing a lot in the last 6 months was that we had all of those users, and there's not that many things in crypto that have that many users. And there's a lot of developers that don't have any users, but they want to have the product. And so we were thinking of a way to actually surface that kind of that large user base that is very differentiated because many of them are first time crypto users. It's very dense, it's very deep in markets. So for example, 50% of Buenos Aires has a verified world ID. So there's like all of those things to that user base that I think are pretty new and pretty interesting to developers or companies. So Tiago actually, so our head of product, had this idea to launch mini apps and essentially just launch a mini app store within our app and make it very easy for developers to build such mini apps. You have, of course, the integrated capability to do financial transactions, to use World ID. So there's a lot of new and I think interesting things to that. And it really went ballistic since we launched it. I think we're now seeing 5 million daily impressions on these mini apps, 1.5 million daily opens of these mini apps. So it's like, I think it is a very interesting primitive for developers, and we are seeing it. And most importantly, there's any given day there's 40 to 100,000 new people actually joining the network. So it's just getting more and more day by day.
I mean, when I saw it, I got sent back in time to, I think it was around 2008 when I was the user of the very, very first iPhone. And I remember the week when Apple opened up the platform. They said, okay, now developers can come and write their own apps for the platform. And they just had like a flood of people coming in. I'm an engineer, so I was also coming up with like app ideas that I could use the iPhone
Yep.
for. And I actually also remember how Sam was with his startup,
He was
was
on
also
stage.
like, yeah, he was on
Yes.
stage at like Apple developer conferences and whatever, and some of the keynotes. So like that's the memory that was triggered me when I saw the App Store in the World app. And by the way, I've tweeted like a couple of times now. I think this is a very like underrated thesis for Worldcoin, because I've actually been looking at the App Store idea in crypto for many years. Like, you probably know I've spent a lot of time with Urbit, which is an operating system, and in effect, you can run like different apps on it in a decentralized way.
Yep.
There's many projects over the years that have tried to create app stores. There's people who are running like either Ethereum flavored or Solana flavored like mobile phones, right, which have their own app stores. So there's a lot of people like going for it, but nobody has really been successful. And I think what WorldCoin is bringing to the table here is you guys already have some of the biggest usage of like any basically crypto application outside of exchanges in crypto.
Yeah.
You have the 15 million users in the app, you have the 7 million registered, and this is a real opportunity to start a flywheel in this app store. So what can you say about, like, you said usage kind of exploded, like what are the actual metrics for the World app store?
Well, I think a lot of it we will need to see over the coming months, given it's basically now 2 weeks old. And so currently, the thing we just look at a lot is, are the new mini apps launching? Are people actually using them? Are they opening them? Are they interacting with them? And that certainly is the case right now. And actually, you see now, we've heard about the first actual credible founders wanting to raise a round for a product on something that launched within World App. And I think, yeah, this is just going to be super, super interesting. When Tiago pitched this to Sam in the first meeting, when we thought about doing this, Sam was actually hyper skeptical, because it was like, look, making app stores work is just something so hard. It like requires such a lot of grit. It will take a long time for us to really get it right. And usage will spike up and down and whatever. So I think we are aware that this is going to be a long-term hard push, but we are super excited about kind of the initial traction we are seeing. There were too many apps that got to essentially 250,000 users within a week, which is crazy. That's for crypto or kind of Web3 standards. That's basically unheard of from what I'm aware. You will know it much better, but I think just getting to that rapid distribution really early on, I think, is something really exciting for developers.
Absolutely. And maybe can you say like a couple of words on what sort of applications are you seeing? Like, obviously anyone building on the platform, they have a few primitives that they can make use of. They can make use of your proof of humanity or cryptographic identity.
Yep.
They can make use of the fact that they're on a blockchain and they have smart contracts. But what are people like actually building with that?
So, well, we see token launches because, of course, it is Sybil resistant. So you can do new kind of token distribution mechanisms. And I think that's actually something we will see becoming more and more of a thing, probably on the platform, because I think, all of essentially every crypto project wants to do some kind of airdrop. Everyone is getting Sybiled in one way or the other. And so I think for token launches, I think it will be something very interesting. And then you have a flywheel, because you will have a large user base of people that are actually interested in these kinds of things. So it might just become the default for new token launches in the coming years, which I think is exciting. We see other things where uniqueness actually matters. So we see kind of polling. We had this funny situation where in Argentina, this was not a mini app, it is now becoming a mini app. In Argentina, someone launched a website, and I don't know what it was called actually. It was something like Vote for Humans or something. It was like looked super crappy, the initial version of it. But every day you could vote on something, and it was like somehow things that Argentinians really cared about. So it was a kind of a soccer player that had his last game, and the question was, where should he play his last game, at which stadium, or it suddenly got super serious and they talked about which kind of political policies they want to see in the country. And so every day you had an option between the two, and pretty quickly that went to, I think, over 100,000 votes or something within a couple of days, over 20,000 a day, because there's 2 million active users within Argentina alone. And so these things are just really hard to predict. It's like, it's very hard to predict that a voting platform in Argentina would be something interesting. And that's, I think, exciting about such a platform play. Yeah, similarly, like one application that got pretty large in the last couple days. Wait, what is it called? Let me open it up. Well, so eSIM, charging over eSIM is definitely something pretty large in countries. But I think the intellectually most interesting one is clip juice, where you can essentially every day you have some amount of juice that you can spend to vote on videos and predict which of them will go viral. And then essentially the winners get more juice and then eventually will win Worldcoin. So I don't know. It's a lot of it's a lot of interesting things.
Yeah,
What
that's
excites you the
very
most? If you think about these primitives, like where do you think this will go?
well. I think fundamentally, look, I back in, I guess, 2016, 2017, crypto ICOs were all the rage, and I, you know, had a lot of visibility into the projects that were bringing ICOs to market. And ICOs, of course, are sales of tokens, or you can think of them as token distributions. And a lot of founders at that time, they wanted to create token distributions that were fair, that essentially
Right.
gave like a certain number of units to every participant. And that was the theory, but like the practice was that people who were like anonymous whales would come in and buy up large
Right.
swaths of these token distributions. And so, I'd sit down with founders and we would try to come up with basically ways to solve this, the Sybil problem. Like, how do you, like, is there an economic mechanism that distributes, the token supply fairly? And basically, the answer is no. There is no such way to fix it unless you have some kind of proof of personhood, type of solution. And we tried
Yep.
everything. We tried like, making it really expensive to participate. Like the whole idea is that you want it to be on chain. You don't want to use like a government issued ID, right, for
Right.
this. Like
Right.
that was like the ethos at the time. And if you make that constraint, then it's basically like mathematically impossible to create Sybil resistance. I mean, there's things you could do to mitigate it, but you'll never like get it, all the way. And so what I think like, fundamentally people should be excited about with proof of personhood is that it is a Sybil resistance solution. And the applications of that, for example, are manifold, right? So you can create fair token distributions. You can create fair airdrops, fair NFT drops. You can create voting systems where it's one person, one vote, right? Like every voting
Yep.
system in crypto so far has been, essentially compromised because it's impossible to prevent whales from accumulating voting power in the form of tokens that they buy in the market. You can get rid of bots, right? We have a social media sort of society today, and it's overrun with all kinds of information that is hard to vet, and you don't know if it's coming from a person or an
Yep.
AI or a bot or a foreign actor or something. And this is like one way of at least separating out the human players from the non-human players, which I think is a huge step forward there. And then, so that's the Sybil resistance thesis. We talked about like, the App Store thesis for Worldcoin. This is the
Yep.
Sybil resistance thesis for Worldcoin. And of course, the most important application of that is kind of the reason why CoinFund sort of underwrote Worldcoin originally when it was Worldcoin, which is that if we have such a system, we think that we can create the widest distribution of a digital currency throughout the world of all time. And the idea is that like I think that Bitcoin is valuable because of the consensus of its distribution, right? So if you
Right.
could create something that's more widely distributed than Bitcoin, then you basically create something that's more valuable than Bitcoin. And maybe like going into that side of things, what do you guys see with Worldcoin, and what does that distribution look like today? And how far through, toward the goal do you think we are today?
Yeah, I think that thesis never changed. So I think that's like, and I think we have this internal strategy doc where we just try to write out how we think things are playing out, and I think it's all a matter of time scale. I think what you just described is this digital currency thesis of, okay, if we get to 1 billion users that actually hold that asset, it will be certainly the widest distributed digital asset, but also it will be one of the largest financial networks. So very early on in crypto, we're super excited about, and people really talked about a lot, but I think we never got to that scale. And so one of the questions we asked super early on, you remember when we pitched you in the early days, was like, yeah, what would happen if you would relaunch something like Bitcoin to 3 billion people? Like, how do you think the world would look like? It certainly would look different. It certainly would be extremely powerful, primitive. And so that is still long term, I think, one of the most exciting outlooks for the project. And we have a long way to go. We are basically 1% there. Let's say we are 15 million users, 7 million verified. But I think we're quickly now getting into a phase where things are getting much more interesting. So I think like once we get to 1 million weekly verifications, which I think we should definitely hit kind of probably H1 next year, things will get very interesting because they will get much more explosive. We will also get to interesting density targets within countries. So one thing, of course, that you understand really well is if you track networks, one of the topics you try to understand really deeply is what is the density within a certain user group. Is it 5% penetration, 20%, 40%? And so currently we are in a couple of countries, we are already at 5%. We have 5% of Portugal, 5% of Argentina, 5% of Chile, all roughly in that category. But I think within the next year, we'll get to 20% of whole countries, which will make it very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we talked about World as App Store. We talked about World as biometric proof of personhood. We just talked about World as widely distributed digital currency. Let's talk about the view of World as identity. And one thing I'll say is, I think as an investor in blockchain, I've been here for about a decade or so. I would say like every week I get approximately on average, one deck a week that is
Right.
doing identity. And it's usually a small startup. It's usually kind of this bottom up view of identity. And it makes total sense. It's like, of course, blockchains should be used for identity.
Right.
But none of those companies ever seem to be able to break out into a critical mass of distribution, adoption, installation. And I think what I've kind of learned from watching all of these companies is what it takes to do identity that actually gets installed is a much more top-down approach. So identity much more often happens like, Elon starts Tesla, they get millions of customers, everybody owns a Tesla now, they have their like login to Tesla account, and suddenly you can log in with Tesla in a bunch of different
Right.
places on the internet, or you log in with Apple, or you log in with Google, or you log in with Facebook. And so identity tends to get adopted like top down rather than bottom up. And what I'm seeing is that of all of the crypto identity projects whose deck I got once a week for the last 10 years, it feels like you guys have the best shot at this. Okay? Why do you like, do you agree with me? And like, if you agree with me, why do you think WorldCoin is a better identity play than probably like your average identity startup right now?
I think there's two parts of that answer. I think one is distribution, as you said, which I think is this top-down view. And the other one is actually a first principled technology view, which is one of the hardest decisions we had to make in the early days as we thought through this problem. It's like we identified pretty quickly, kind of everything started with this idea of Metcalfe's law, wide distribution, And essentially, a lot of amazing things will happen if we can actually launch a token equally to many people and all the resulting primitives that will come from that, because those people will have wallets. You can build an app on top of that. So that's how everything started. But pretty quickly, we realized that kind of the Sybil proof of human mechanism is the crux of the problem. And then we went into that. We believe that AI will be this like very strong force that will challenge a lot of the identity systems that are currently out there and things like that. Back then, you had three big categories of things you could look into. It was essentially, you use government identity systems. You use what people called web of trust. So you use online behavior. For example, you have a Facebook account and you have used it for a couple of years. And then on top of that, you also have a GitHub account and you use that for a couple of years. And then you transacted on that other app for 10 times in the last week. And with that, you essentially build up a reputation score and you would use that as an identifier. And then the last category was biometrics. And because we believe that we'll pass the Turing test in the coming years, we believe that this whole web of trust approaches, they will all break pretty quickly. Government identity systems, we just thought, are one, it's against the general thesis of the whole space. The whole point is that you build internet native infrastructure. Second, it's not inclusive. There's large parts of the world where this wouldn't work. And lastly, the privacy implications of that might actually be very concerning. And so we decided we will go into that path of building essentially a complete separate system, completely from the ground up, first principles based, which is a biometric proof of human. And if you really think about it, that is the only other players right now in the world that solve something like that are actually governments, because governments, they make sure that you truly parallel infrastructure to that currently exists, because it's really, we took it to the extreme. We don't rely on any other services. We built this infrastructure from the ground up in a decentralized and open source manner. And so we hope that people can really trust that as an alternative signal. So I think that's one part of the answer, is this kind of first principled, a new technology that solves that problem from ground up and doesn't rely on other systems. And that's just a really hard thing to do. And the second one is the big focus on scale. And so I think getting to a large distribution versus trying to build bottom up and then try to get people excited for your identity application, which we thought very early on would never work. And so I think if we end up succeeding in that space, I think it will be those two. But I wonder, what do you think?
Well, I like all the things you said. I think you're totally right that, so far the providers of this type of service have been governments. And that's actually like a really interesting aspect of what you guys have been doing. Because as you do this top-down strategy where you're going out to dozens of countries all over the world, you're seeing kind of a mixed set of reactions from governments. There's some governments that have kind of an immune response. They start like, doing diligence. You have other governments that are competing with you because they have their own biometric systems. And you have other governments that are actually like embracing the technology and integrating it. So I wonder, like, what can you say about the reception on a jurisdictional level that this technology has received?
Yes, it really changed, I think, is the first statement. I think when we launched, AI was not that much of a thing. And we talked about, look, AI will be this big thing, the internet will change, we will need proof of human, and regulators and governments are just, what are you talking about? This sounds batshit crazy. And just talk to us when we're actually at the time. So in the beginning, pretty much universally, every conversation was hostile because they just didn't understand the existence or why this exists, why this is needed. That completely shifted within the last year, where I think now pretty much universally every government we talk to said this is needed, and at the very minimum want input from us on how to build it. Then I think the reactions deviate from embracing it if they understand that their infrastructure is so far behind that it will be very hard for them to catch up, to if it's a kind of more advanced infrastructure country, it's like, how can we integrate both systems so they're cross-compatible? Because what World ID will be, of course, it will be global, versus most government systems are just based on their country. And so it doesn't really matter for Singapore if Singapore has this amazing identity infrastructure, but all the services they use are global. there's nothing that Singapore can do about that, no matter how great their identity infrastructure is. So I think that embracing of cross compatibility on kind of a deep government integration, I think is super exciting. And then we had like truly batshit crazy conversations as well, where I don't want to talk about the country, but we had one country, somewhat high government official, that reached out and was like, well, just FYI, we will not allow Worldcoin to ever launch in this country because it will make democratic elections much easier, and we don't want that here. Which was technically a democratic country. And I was like, that is a crazy thing to say. So yeah, I think it will have, at scale, it will have all kinds of interesting consequences. I think, like, personally, seeing an election being run on that infrastructure, I think it will be super cool at scale. And because I think it's part of the whole reason we are here. It's like, I think it can be a kind of a big force for freedom and individual empowerment. And that's, I think, what the whole point of crypto is in some sense, is it's the freedom stack.
It's an interesting thought also because today is election day in the US, as you know.
Right.
Awesome. So I just wanted to ask you about the number of devices, right? So one of the impressive things that was true of WorldCoin early on, before you guys rebranded, was that you were getting some very promising conversion numbers throughout the world. And the number of devices that were out there in the world was very small. Like, for many years, you guys had just a couple of hundred of devices, and most of them were not even in the United States. I still think most of them are not in the United States today.
Correct. Yeah.
But now you have kind of the second generation of the device coming out. Can you talk about, like, how many devices are out in the world now? How many do you expect? And what are sort of the features of the devices? Where are they going to be? How will people get access to them?
Yeah. So a lot of, in the past, I've always been burnt when I talk about these things because I'm always way too optimistic for everything in terms of timelines. We passed this, I think, very important milestone where previously the whole UX, how the devices work, like you basically you had people around these devices. You had like staff. Essentially, it was not TFH staff, it was operators, but they were essentially next to these devices. And so what we launched at the event with also the new generation of the device is, actually I have one here. It's the new gen, which looks much cooler, but is a self-serve and the kind of self-serve fixture. So it means that we can now actually roll out these devices. We can put them in all kinds of convenience stores and gas stations, etc., and don't require any staff. So I think that will be a massive, will make it much, much easier to scale up. And so we are rolling that out right now. It's launched to the entire fleet. And this device, so that's the kind of the next generation of the orb, is still manufacturing ramp up, I think, is Q1. That's what we were aiming at, early Q1. And then we will see them out in the world. And we're currently in a quite aggressive scale up, at least for us. We scaled in the last 8 weeks from 300 to 700 devices. So we roughly doubled. That's roughly the rate we want to keep. So I think the internal thing we push for is get to 3,000 devices deployed. Well, actually 3,000 locations deployed by end of Q1, which is another order of magnitude. So that is what we're looking at roughly.
Okay, amazing. And by the way, listeners, if you're familiar with CoinFund and you live in New York, we have one of the first generation devices in our office. So if you know someone from CoinFund, reach out, get a scan. Alex, when you guys launch the second generation, I'd love to grab one and convert everybody in Miami. Will people be buying that? Is that something they have to buy from the company, or how does that work?
Yeah, so that's the other thing we actually launched with the event, is that now everyone can actually buy them or lease them. So it's not formally live, but we announced it, so it's going to also go live early next year, which again will make the operations much more open. So apparently it's more TFH focused, but that will open up, and so everyone can order or rent these devices. Of course, you will not have to do that. You will get one, but that's how it will go. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, so, and then you alluded, like, in the beginning of our conversation, we talked about the event you guys had a couple of weeks ago in San Francisco. First of all, Sam came out, you and I were reflecting how that was a really big moment for WorldCoin. to see Sam kind of out in front promoting it. I think a lot of the sentiment has really increased to the positive side, and a lot of excitement has
Yep.
emanated from that event. And in that event, you announced kind of your rebrand to World. You announced the second generation device, which we just talked about. You announced World Chain, which we covered, and also there was something about the device, which is, what was it? Delivery
Oh, on demand. So you order
on
it.
demand.
So in many countries, you could just order it to your home or to your office, like similar to Uber Eats. And actually, we'll partner with Rappi in
Mm.
LATAM to do that.
What's the purpose of that? Just to make it like
The purpose is
easier to
just
get a
to
scan?
reduce the friction for users to verify. And in fact, one thing that I believe that's might be interesting to you and to people that observe it more closely, but I think currently we just talk about verification. So you go to an orb, and essentially an equivalent would be you get your passport. But I think what will become the much, much higher usage will be authentication, because that's where actually also government systems are just not at all prepared for right now. So you will need to, for high value transactions, and the kind of the value per transaction where you will need to do that will continuously decrease. You will need to authenticate with a trusted device that it's actually you versus some kind of deepfake version. And so I think we're heading to a world where you will need to continuously re-authenticate for all kinds of use cases.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we will push really hard to reduce that friction further and further. So also use cases like that can pick up.
That makes a lot of sense. And in the past, we've talked a lot about kind of the security of the device, in the sense that, like, you really don't want people to be able to like resell identities. And so this idea of like authentication is really important, right? Because if you
Right.
resell, but then you require re-authentication, that's not going to work, right? So that it
Yes,
really
correct.
reduces the incentives for people to abuse the system. And that's a really innovative, like, on-demand delivery. I feel like that's a really
Yes.
innovative way of lowering their friction. So that's awesome. Okay, so we're coming to the end of our show here. We covered a lot of ground. Let me ask you the question that we always ask people that we bring onto the show, which is, Alex, from your perspective, what's one thing in crypto that no one is talking about, but more people should be paying attention to? What are people sleeping on?
Mm. My general point is always that I think the crypto adoption will probably ramp up in ways that are not totally obvious to people that sit in San Francisco or New York. I still do believe that if you genuinely care about crypto adoption, I think you will look into payment use cases. I think you will look in kind of saving money, interacting with money, paying with crypto, and it will be in parts of the world where that infrastructure is really really terrible. And I think that's broadly Africa, some parts of LATAM, and I think that is something to look at if you're a builder and really try to understand these things in depth. But I see that shift. I think like generally more and more people are talking about that and taking that seriously and try to adapt their use cases for that. But I think that is true.
That's actually like a really good point. It does feel like, especially lately, that in the next, maybe, next leg of adoption of crypto is starting to feel a lot more like the boring use cases that we've always sort of thought
Right.
crypto would be
Yep.
good at. So,
Correct.
payments, identity, like all these things that we've been working on for so long, it feels like they're
Yep.
finally coming to market. You guys are part of that story. By the way, one question on payments for you is, given your context in some of these developing contexts, how much are payments part of like the world story? Like, is that going to be an important business for this network?
Yeah, I think so. You know what's interesting is that the deviation in terms of how sophisticated systems are in countries is extremely high. It's like, for example, you sometimes see complete outliers. So in Kenya, for example, you have M-Pesa, which is a mobile payment interface that people use with their phones. And it's similar things are now live also in other parts of Africa. But that is kind of a truly digital payment interface at scale. And I was very surprised the first time I learned about this in depth 2 years ago. Or you have India with Aadhaar and UPI, which essentially has the largest scale identity payment interface in the world run by a government. And so what I'm trying to say is I think the way I try to run things right now is very much like one-off bets. I try to understand countries in depth and then try to focus our products on whatever is the lowest denominator in a country. So it could be the identity infrastructure is extremely terrible and the government really needs help, then we will talk to the government and see if we can help. If the payment infrastructure is very high friction and very dysfunctional, we will do the same thing on the World App side and we'll go really hard into payments. And so that's kind of how we try to run things right now.
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. All right, folks. So finishing thought for you from me is, as you probably know, if you're in crypto and blockchain, decentralized AI is a huge topic these days. There's so much excitement about it. Worldcoin is, sorry, World. I have to get used to the rebrand. World is really the first original, intersection of AI and Web3 projects. It's certainly the first one that we invested in. I think this summer of 2025 that we're heading into, we're going to start to see decentralized AI products come to market and really start to demonstrate some of the value that these products are bringing, not just to the Web3 space, but to AI broadly and to commerce broadly. And I think World is going to be a huge part of that. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate having you on the show, taking an hour out of your incredibly busy schedule to chat with us. For those of you who tuned in, thank you so much for listening. Let's keep the conversation going. Leave us a review and let us know what you thought. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, I'm Jay Brook, JBRUKH. Alex is at Alex Blania, Blania. Make sure you download us where you get your podcasts. Leave us a note, and we'll be back to dig deeper into the ideas of the blockchain space. Thank you very much.